The machine breathed for him. In and out. In and out. A monitor above the bed counted a heartbeat that had almost stopped. In that quiet Vienna hospital room, the most famous voice of his generation could not make a single sound. There was a tube in his throat. His hands lay still on the white sheet. George Michael was asleep. The deep, dangerous sleep doctors choose only when they are fighting for a life. What happened in the 5 weeks that followed, almost nobody truly knows. It began with a tour that was supposed to heal him. Symphonica, autumn 2011. George in a dark suit, a full orchestra behind him, singing the songs of his life to people who had grown older right alongside him. He was 48. He had survived grief, scandal, and years he barely remembered. This tour was his way back. Night after night, city after city, he gave everything he had. But somewhere between those cities, something was already going wrong inside his chest. He felt it first as a heaviness, a cold he could not shake. Most people would have gone home. George kept singing. He had cancelled shows before, years earlier, and he still carried the guilt of every empty seat. So he pushed through the aching mornings and the hotel rooms that all looked the same. He told the people around him he was fine. He had spent his whole life telling people he was fine. This time, his body stopped asking permission. By the time the tour reached Vienna in late November, he could barely climb a staircase without stopping to breathe. The concert was scheduled. The hall was sold out. Thousands of people were planning their evening around him. And in his hotel room, George Michael sat on the edge of the bed, trying to pull air into lungs that no longer wanted to open. The show was cancelled. Then the next one. Then everything. Because by then, the doctors had seen what was really happening. Pneumonia. Not the kind you rest away at home with soup and blankets. The kind that fills the lungs like water filling a room. Within days, it had a more frightening name. Severe, spreading, relentless. His fever climbed. His oxygen fell. The man who had sung to 70,000 people at Wembley could not finish a sentence without gasping. And the doctors in Vienna made a decision that would save his life and terrify everyone who loved him. They put him to sleep. A medical coma, sedation deep enough to let machines take over the work his body could no longer do. Before he went under, there was a moment. A hospital room. Strangers in masks moving quickly around him. Somewhere far away, a phone in England that had not yet rung. He was alone in a foreign country, in a foreign language, about to close his eyes without knowing if he would ever open them again. He never said what he thought of in that moment. To keep him breathing, the doctors performed a tracheotomy, an opening cut into his throat, just below the vocal cords, below the voice. Of all the places in the body, the treatment had to pass through his throat. The instrument that had carried careless whisper, silenced by a plastic tube. For 30 years he had given the world his voice. Now the world would have to give him back his breath. The doctors were not thinking about music. They were thinking about the next hour. Outside the hospital, the world found out slowly. First a cancelled concert, then a statement, then the words no fan wanted to read. Intensive care. Flowers began arriving at the hospital gates in the Vienna cold. Candles. Handwritten cards in languages he would never read. Women who had loved his music since they were girls stood on the pavement in winter coats, not knowing what else to do. Inside, behind those walls, it was worse than any of them were told. Later, one of his doctors said it plainly. It had been touch and go. There were days when the people treating him were not sure he would see the morning. His partner flew to his side. Close friends were quietly warned. In living rooms across America, people who had never met him found themselves praying for a man they knew only through a voice. And the voice itself lay silent in a bed in Vienna, held to life by machines. Then, slowly, something shifted. His fever broke. His lungs, inch by inch, began to take back their own work. After weeks of darkness, the sedation was lifted, and George Michael opened his eyes in a room he did not recognize, in a body that felt like it belonged to someone else. He had lost weeks of his life. He had lost weight, strength, certainty. And when he tried to speak, he discovered the thing that frightened him more than dying had. Nothing came out. The tube was still in his throat. And even after it came out, there was no guarantee. Vocal cords are delicate things, and a tracheotomy sits millimeters from everything a singer is. In those first days awake, George Michael faced a question almost too cruel to say out loud. He had survived, but had the voice survived with him? He lay awake at night in the hum of the machines, wondering if his last note had already been sung. He told almost no one this fear. There was another weight too, one the newspapers never printed. George had spent his adult life losing people. Anselmo, taken far too young. His mother, Leslie, gone before she ever grew old. He had stood at gravesides and wondered why he was the one still standing. And now, in a Vienna hospital bed, he had come to the very edge of joining them and been sent back. A man cannot come that close and return unchanged. The question was what the change would be. The nurses noticed it first. The way he watched them, the way he thanked them, with his eyes before he could speak, and then in a hoarse whisper that sounded nothing like the records. These were people who did not treat him like a star. They treated him like a man who needed washing, feeding, turning, saving. Austrian nurses on night shifts, doctors who came in on their days off. He had known the love of millions. He had rarely known care like this. Christmas was coming. And George Michael understood something about Christmas that most of the world did not. It was the season loss had circled for years, the season he had written his most famous song about. Now, in December 2011, he was learning to breathe again in a foreign hospital while the city outside strung up its lights. He asked the people around him almost nothing about his career. He asked whether he would be home in time. He was. Weakened, thinner, moving carefully, George Michael came home to Highgate in December and did something he almost never did anymore. He walked out of his own front door and stood before the cameras, unscripted, unprotected. His voice was fragile. His eyes were wet before he finished his first sentence. And what he said had nothing to do with albums or tours. He talked about the strangers in Vienna who had refused to let him die. He stood in the cold in a dark coat and said it plainly. The doctors had told him it was touch and go, that they had spent weeks keeping him alive. He stopped. He pressed his lips together the way a man does when the words are bigger than his mouth. Then he said he was lucky. Lucky in a way he could not explain. The cameras caught something the public had rarely seen from George Michael. Not the performer, the survivor, trying not to cry and failing. What almost nobody saw was what happened inside the house after the door closed. Friends said he was different that winter, quieter. He would stop in the middle of ordinary moments, a kettle boiling, a song on the radio, and just look at things, as if seeing them for the first time. He had been given something very few people receive, a look over the edge and a road back. He did not spend it on fear, he spent it on gratitude. But gratitude, for George, was never just a feeling, because there was still the question of the voice. Through that winter and spring, privately, carefully, he tested it. Scales in empty rooms, notes held 1 second longer each week. Some days it was there, some days it cracked and vanished, and the old terror came back cold. He was 48, and everything he was had always lived in his throat. If the voice was gone, who was he? He kept singing anyway, alone, to no one, the way he had as a boy in Finchley. And then, in September 2012, George Michael did something that told the world exactly what Vienna had meant to him. He went back. Not for the money, not for an arena. He returned to the city where he had almost died and performed for the people who had saved him. The doctors, the nurses, the staff who had spent their nights keeping his heart beating. He stood on a stage in Vienna and sang to them. The voice had survived, and he had chosen who would hear it first. People who were there said he kept looking out into the seats where the medical staff sat, that he sang differently that night, not to the back of the hall, but to particular faces. Somewhere in that audience were the hands that had adjusted his machines, that had held his wrist in the dark to count a pulse. He owed them everything, and there was only one currency he had ever fully trusted. So he paid them in the only way he knew. He sang. He also wrote. That summer, he released a song called White Light, a song about the moment between staying and going, about coming back from the very edge. Listen closely, and you can hear it. A man singing about being alive the way other people sing about being in love. The words said he was still here. Underneath them was something more fragile. The astonishment of a man who had not expected to be. The public heard a comeback single. It was closer to a confession, but survival is complicated. The years after Vienna were not simple ones. The body remembered what it had been through. Old shadows, loneliness, the habits he used against it, did not vanish just because death had brushed past him. Those who loved him watched him carry both things at once, a deep, real gratitude for his life and the same old ache that had followed him since North London. He had been given more time. Nobody could tell him how much. 5 years later, on Christmas morning 2016, the time ran out, quietly, at home, in his sleep. And when the news broke, many people thought back to Vienna. To the winter, the world almost lost him, and didn't. Some called those 5 years borrowed, but borrowed is the wrong word. They were given by strangers in masks in a foreign city who never asked for anything back. 5 more years of songs, of quiet kindnesses, of phone calls that mattered. Vienna gave the world that. For 30 years, George Michael had given the world his voice. In Vienna, the world gave him back his breath, and for 5 more years, he spent it well. When you hear him sing now, remember there was a December when that voice lay silent under hospital lights, and strangers refused to let it end. That is the part of the story worth keeping.
If this story changed the way you remember George Michael, stay with us. There are more untold chapters still hidden behind the voice, the fame, and the silence. Like the video, subscribe, and let the next story find you.